There are moments in a man's life when he understands, without being told, that something is about to become sacred. Sheriff James Jim Caldwell experienced one of those moments on a Tuesday morning in March of 1963, when he walked into the motor pool of the Yazoo County Sheriff's Office and laid eyes on a 1978 Dodge Monaco painted in the crisp white and forest green that marked it as a vessel of the law. The car hadn't been assigned to him yet. It was just sitting there, fresh from the dealer in Jackson, still smelling of new vinyl and the faint ghost of industrial solvents. But Jim knew, the way a horseman knows a good mount, that this machine and he were meant to work together. He'd been a deputy for 6 years by then, had driven a succession of vehicles, a 67 Dodge Polara, a 71 Plymouth Fury, even a 75 Ford LTD that had more rust than paint by the time they finally retired it. But none of them had felt right. None of them had felt like home. The Monaco was different. It was built on a body-on-frame construction that spoke of an era when American automakers still believed in doing things right. The 440 Magnum engine, that legendary big block that could push out 375 horsepower, sat under that long hood like a sleeping giant, waiting for the right hand to wake it up. The transmission was a 727 torque flight, a 3-speed automatic that shifted smooth as butter and could handle anything the roads of Mississippi could throw at it. And the frame? Heavy-duty police suspension, reinforced for the kind of work that regular civilian cars could never handle. But what got Jim, what really got him, was the sheriff's star painted on the driver's side door. Not some generic police emblem, but the actual 5-pointed star of Yazoo County, rendered in gold leaf against the white paint, with the words Yazoo County Sheriff in bold letters above and below it. That star meant something. It meant authority. It meant service. It meant that whoever drove this car carried the weight of an entire county's safety on their shoulders. Jim ran his hand along the hood, feeling the perfect smoothness of the factory paint. He opened the driver's door and slid behind the wheel, bench seat upholstered in black vinyl, worn already by the test drives but still solid, still dignified. The steering wheel was thick and substantial, wrapped in black leather with a horn pad that had the Dodge emblem stamped right in the center. The dashboard was a sweep of chrome and brushed aluminum, with gauges that read true and switches that clicked with satisfying precision. The radio was a Motorola police band unit, mounted between the seats, its speaker grill promising the constant connection to dispatch that would keep Jim tethered to his duty for the next 15 years. The spotlight controller was mounted on the driver's door, a simple hand crank that could swivel the roof-mounted light 180 degrees, cutting through the Mississippi darkness like a sword of justice. Under the dash was a shotgun rack, empty now but waiting for the Remington 870 that would become as familiar to Jim as his own right arm. He sat there for a long time, hands on the wheel, not turning the key, just feeling the weight of the moment. Outside, the March sun was climbing higher, and the air was already starting to carry that thick, humid quality that Mississippi summer would bring in abundance. The Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks in the parking lot swayed slightly in the breeze, and Jim could hear the distant sound of the Yazoo River, that great artery of the South that carried everything from steamboats to secrets for nearly 200 years. Sheriff William Bill Thornton found him there an hour later, still sitting in the car, still not having started the engine. Bill was a man in his 60s, had been running the Yazoo County Sheriff's Office for 22 years, and he'd seen enough deputies come and go to know which ones had the right stuff and which ones were just passing through. He took one look at Jim sitting in that Monaco and smiled. "That's your car now," Bill said, leaning against the door frame. "She's all yours, Jim. I want you to take good care of her. This car, she's going to be your partner for a long time, if you treat her right." Jim finally turned the key. The 440 Magnum fired up with a deep, authoritative rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the motor pool. The engine settled into an idle that was smooth and purposeful, and Jim could feel mechanical sympathy that exists between a good man and a good machine. This car would never let him down. He understood that with absolute certainty, and in return, he would never let it down either. "I'll take care of her," Jim said, and he meant every word. The first few weeks with the Monaco were about learning each other. Jim would take the car out on patrol and discover its quirks and strengths. The power steering was responsive but heavy, requiring a confident hand. The brakes were powerful but needed to be modulated carefully. Slam on them too hard, and the car would nosedive, the front suspension compressing like a boxer taking a punch. The suspension was stiff, designed to kind of rough roads that crisscross the county, but it gave the car a presence on the highway that made other vehicles seem to shrink away from it. The 440 engine was a beast. On the straightaways, Jim could feel all that horsepower waiting, eager to be unleashed. But he was a careful driver, a professional, and he understood that the power was there for emergencies, for those moments when life depended on the ability to accelerate from 0 to 80 in a handful of seconds. Most days, he kept the Monaco at a steady, purposeful pace, cruising the back roads of Yazoo County, letting folks see the star on the door, letting them know that the law was present and attentive. The radio crackle became the soundtrack to his days. Unit 1. We have a 10 to 50 on Highway 49, approximately 3 miles north of the 61 intersection. Traffic accident. 10 to 4 en route. The code became a language, a shorthand for the work of keeping a community safe. 10 to 20, what's your location? 10 to 4, message received. 10 to 7, out of service. 10 to 8, in service. The Monaco responded to every call, never hesitating, never complaining. Jim's partner in those early days was a man named Deputy Robert Bobby Simmons, a younger guy, maybe 25, still green but eager to learn. Bobby would ride in the passenger seat of the Monaco, and Jim would teach him the roads, the people, the rhythms of the county. This car, Jim would tell him, she's not just transportation. She's a symbol. When folks see the star on the door, they need to know that whoever's driving it is someone they can trust, someone who's going to do right by them. Bobby would nod, understanding in the way young men do when they're learning from someone who knows what they're talking about. And the Monaco would roll on, its white paint gleaming in the Mississippi sun, the green stripe running along its side like a mark of pride. The relationship between Jim and the Monaco deepened with every mile. He learned to listen to the engine, to hear the subtle changes in its note that might indicate a problem. He knew exactly how much pressure to apply to the accelerator to get the smooth acceleration he wanted, and he understood the car's weight distribution well enough to take the curves on the back roads with a confidence that made younger deputies nervous when they rode with him. He maintained the car obsessively. Every Saturday morning, without fail, Jim would be at the motor pool with a bucket of soapy water, a chamois cloth, and a can of turtle wax. He'd wash that Monaco from bumper to bumper, paying special attention to the sheriff's star on the door, making sure it gleamed with the respect it deserved. He'd check the oil, top off the coolant, inspect the tires for wear, and make sure every light on the car was functioning properly. The headlights, the taillights, the brake lights, the spotlight, all of it had to be perfect. You treat that car like it's a member of your family, Sheriff Thornton said one Saturday, watching Jim work. And Jim looked up from polishing the hood and smiled. In a way, she is, he said, out there on those roads. This car is all that stands between me and whatever trouble might be waiting. I depend on her. She depends on me. That's family, far as I'm concerned. The 1978 Dodge Monaco became legendary in Yazoo County. Folks would see it coming down the road, and they'd straighten up, they'd slow down. They'd remember that there was law and order in the land. But they also knew that if they were in trouble, if they needed help, that car would come. Jim Caldwell and his Monaco weren't about harassment or intimidation. They were about service. They were about the old-fashioned idea that a lawman's job was to protect and serve, and to do it with dignity and respect. Years passed. The 1960s gave way to the 1970s, and Mississippi changed in ways both obvious and subtle. The civil rights movement had left its mark on the South, and Yazoo County, like everywhere else, had to reckon with a new reality. Jim Caldwell, to his credit, was a man who understood that the law applied equally to everyone, regardless of the color of their skin. He'd made enemies for that stance, but he'd also earned respect from people who mattered. And through it all, the Monaco remained constant. Its white paint faded slightly under the relentless Mississippi sun, but it was still white. Its green stripe became a little less vibrant, but it was still there, The engine still ran strong, still responded to Jim's touch on the accelerator with the same eagerness it had shown on that first day in the motor pool. By the early 1970s, Jim had been promoted to sheriff, taking over from Bill Thornton when Bill decided it was time to hang up his badge. And the first thing Jim did was make sure the Monaco was his official vehicle. Some of the newer deputies wanted the newer cars, the 1975 Fords and the 1976 Plymouths that were starting to come into the fleet. But Jim wouldn't hear of it. The Monaco was his car, and he was going to drive it until one of them gave out. And he had a feeling it wouldn't be the car. The bond between Jim and the Monaco had become something more than just a working relationship. It was a partnership, a trust, a mutual understanding that they were in this together, for better or worse. The car knew Jim's habits, the way he preferred to take certain curves, the particular pressure he liked to apply to the accelerator. And Jim knew every sound the Monaco made, every vibration, every subtle shift in performance that might indicate a problem. This was the foundation of their relationship as they headed into the 1980s. A time of change, a time of challenge, a time when the old ways were being tested by a new world. But Jim and his Monaco, they would face it together, as they had faced everything else. Because that's what partners do. They stand by each other. They trust each other. And they never, ever give up on each other. Time moves differently in Mississippi. It doesn't march forward like it does in other places. It seeps like the swamp water that's around the county, slow and inevitable and impossible to stop. For Sheriff Jim Caldwell, those 15 years between 1963 and 1978 passed in a blur of radio calls, midnight pursuits, domestic disputes, traffic stops, and 1,000 small acts of service that make up a lawman's life. And through it all, the 1978 Dodge Monaco was there, steady as a heartbeat, reliable as the sunrise, never once letting him down. By the late 1970s, the Monaco had accumulated over 180,000 miles on its odometer. The white paint, once pristine, had faded to a softer, more weathered shade, marked by the red clay dust of Mississippi backroads and the relentless sun that beat down on the car for months at a time. The green stripe along the side had become almost a pale ghost of its former color. But the sheriff's star on the door, that had been religiously maintained, polished, and protected, still gleaming with the dignity it had carried since the day the car rolled into the motor pool. The interior told the story of those 15 years in different ways. The black vinyl bench seat had developed a patina of use, the fabric worn smooth in places where Jim sat day after day, shift after shift. The steering wheel bore the marks of his hands, not visible to the casual observer, but Jim could feel them, could sense the history in the leather. The dashboard had developed a few cracks from the heat and the sun, but all the gauges still worked, still read true. The radio, that constant companion, had been replaced once when the original unit finally gave up the ghost, but the new one was installed in the same spot, maintaining the continuity of the connection between Jim and dispatch. The engine had been rebuilt once, around 1971, when the original 440 Magnum started to show signs of age. But the rebuild had been done right, with quality parts and careful attention to detail. The horsepower might have been slightly less than it was in the beginning, but the engine still ran strong, still had the power to accelerate from 0 to 60 in under 8 seconds when Jim needed it to. The transmission had been serviced regularly. The suspension had been maintained. The brakes had been replaced more than once, but the fundamental integrity of the machine remained intact. What had changed most over those 15 years wasn't the car. It was a world around it. Mississippi in 1963 was one thing, a state still struggling with the aftermath of the civil rights movement, still dealing with the tensions and the divisions that had marked the South for 100 years. But Mississippi in 1978 was something different. The interstate highway system had been completed, bringing commerce and change. The cotton fields were giving way to soybeans and timber operations. The small towns that had once been the heart of the county were starting to hollow out as younger people moved to Jackson or Memphis or Chicago, chasing opportunities that the rural South couldn't provide. Jim Caldwell had watched this transformation from the seat of his Monaco, had seen it unfold mile by mile, year by year. He'd pulled over speeders who were fleeing the farms, heading north to find their fortune. He'd responded to accidents on the new highways where people were driving too fast, trying to cover in hours what used to take days. He dealt with the increasing problem of drug trafficking, as the highways became conduits for substances that would have been unimaginable in the rural Mississippi of his youth. And yet, through all of this change, the Monaco remained a constant. It was a symbol of continuity, of the law and order that persisted even as the world transformed around it. When Jim rolled up to a scene, whether it was a domestic dispute in a small town or an accident on the highway, folks knew that help had arrived. They knew that someone who cared, someone who had dedicated his life to service, was there to help them. The relationship between Jim and the Monaco had evolved into something almost spiritual by the late 1970s. They moved together as one unit, the man and the machine perfectly synchronized. Jim could feel the car's mood, could sense when something wasn't quite right, could anticipate how it would respond in any given situation. And the car, in its own mechanical way, seemed to understand Jim, seemed to know what he wanted before he even asked for it. There was a particular moment in 1976 that exemplified this bond. Jim was responding to a 10 to 33 emergency call on Highway 49, about 20 miles north of the county seat. A tractor-trailer had jackknifed it in a rainstorm, blocking both lanes of traffic, and there was a family sedan that had collided with it. Jim didn't know the details, just that there were injuries and that he needed to get there fast. The Monaco had responded like it understood the urgency. The 440 engine roared to life, and Jim pushed the car to speeds it wasn't technically designed for, over 100 miles per hour on a rain-slick highway. The power steering responded to every micro-adjustment of the wheel. The brakes held true when he needed to downshift and slow for curves. The traction was as good as could be expected from a car of that era, and Jim's years of experience with the Monaco's handling characteristics meant he could push it harder than a less experienced driver ever could. He'd made it to the scene in under 12 minutes, arriving before the ambulance, before the fire department, before any other units. And when he got there, he found a scene of chaos. The tractor-trailer was jackknifed across both lanes. The family sedan was crumpled against the trailer's side. And inside that sedan were 3 people, a mother, a father, and a young daughter, maybe 8 years old, all of them trapped, all of them injured. Jim had called it in, set up the road flares, and then done what he'd been trained to do. He'd taken control of the scene, kept the injured calm, and coordinated with the fire department when they arrived to extract the family from the wreckage. The little girl had a fractured arm and some lacerations, but she would be okay. The parents had broken ribs and internal injuries, but they would survive. And when the ambulance pulled away with the family inside, the mother had looked out the window and caught Jim's eye, and in that moment, there was a profound gratitude, a recognition that this man and his car had made the difference between tragedy and survival. Jim had driven the Monaco back to the county seat that night, and when he'd parked in the motor pool, he'd sat in the driver's seat for a long time, hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline. He'd reached over and patted the dashboard right above the glove compartment, and he'd whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for being there. Thank you for not letting me down." It was a small gesture, but it encapsulated everything about the relationship between Jim and the Monaco. The car wasn't just a tool. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a partner, a companion, a witness to his life's work. And Jim treated it with the respect and gratitude that such a partnership deserved. By 1978, Jim was 52 years old. His hair had turned gray, and there were lines in his face that hadn't been there in 1963. His hands showed the wear of 15 years of holding a steering wheel, of gripping a shotgun, of shaking hands with citizens and fellow lawmen. His back ached from years of sitting in the driver's seat, and his knees complained when he had to run or climb. The job had taken its toll, as it always does. But the Monaco was still strong. The engine still ran true. The transmission still shifted smooth. The suspension still held the road. The brakes still responded. The lights still shone. The radio still crackled with the voices of dispatch and the other units in the county. The car was aging, yes, but it was aging with dignity, with the kind of grace that comes from being well-maintained and well-loved. Jim knew that his time was coming to an end. Not immediately, but he could feel it approaching, the way a sailor feels the approach of a storm on the horizon. The new Ford Crown Victorias were coming into the fleet, sleeker and more modern, with air conditioning and power windows and all the conveniences of the 1970s. The younger deputies wanted those cars. They wanted the new technology, the comfort, the status symbol of driving the latest model. But Jim held on to the Monaco. He requested it for his patrols, insisted that it be maintained, refused to let it be retired to the back lot where the older vehicles went to rust and decay. Because he understood something that the younger generation didn't, that a good machine, properly maintained, was worth more than a dozen new ones that were built to be disposable. And more than that, he understood that the Monaco wasn't just a car. It was a record of his service, a testament to his commitment, a memorial to the work he'd done and the lives he'd touched. The Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks in the swamps of Yazoo County had seen the Monaco pass by countless times. The red clay roads had felt the weight of its tires. The Mississippi sun had beaten down on its hood. The night air had cooled its engine after long patrols. The car had become part of the landscape, part of the fabric of the county, as much a fixture as the courthouse or the sheriff's office itself. And Jim Caldwell, the man who had driven it for 15 years, had become inseparable from it. They were one unit, one symbol, one promise to the people of Yazoo County that the law was present, that justice was being served, that someone cared enough to be there when they needed help. But all things eventually must come to an end. And for Jim and the Monaco, that end was approaching faster than either of them realized. There are moments in life when a man knows with absolute certainty that something is ending. Sheriff Jim Caldwell experienced that moment on a Tuesday morning in October 1978, when he walked into the motor pool of the Yazoo County Sheriff's Office for what would be the last time as an active lawman. He didn't know it yet, not consciously, but his body knew. His hands knew. His heart knew. The Monaco knew. It was a crisp autumn morning, the kind that Mississippi rarely gets, when humidity that had strangled the state all summer finally loosened its grip. The sun was just coming up over the swamps, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the Spanish moss hanging from the live oaks looked like it was on fire. Jim had driven this route thousands of times, but this morning felt different. This morning felt like a goodbye. He was 53 years old. 30 years of service to the people of Yazoo County, 15 of them in the Monaco. His body was telling him it was time to stop. His knees ached constantly now, and his back had developed persistent pain that no amount of rest could cure. His heart, the one that had been so strong for so long, had started to show signs of weakness. His doctor had warned him, "Jim, you need to slow down. You need to rest. You're not a young man anymore." Jim had resisted. He'd always resisted. The idea of retirement, of stepping away from the work that had defined his entire adult life, was something he couldn't quite wrap his mind around. Who was he if he wasn't Sheriff Jim Caldwell? What would he do with his days if he wasn't patrolling the roads of Yazoo County, if he wasn't responding to calls, if he wasn't serving the people who depended on him? But his wife, Margaret, had been patient. She'd been patient for 30 years, raising their 2 children mostly alone while Jim was out on patrol. She'd been patient through the long nights when he'd come home exhausted, through the dangerous situations that had occasionally put his life in jeopardy, through the stress and the worry that came with being married to a lawman. And now, with their children grown and moved away, with their grandchildren being born in places far from Mississippi, Margaret wanted her husband back. She wanted to travel. She wanted to sit on a porch and watch the sunset, without worrying about whether a call would come in and pull him away. "It's time, Jim," she'd said to him the night before, sitting in their living room with a cup of coffee in her hands. "It's time to let someone else carry the weight. It's time to come home." And Jim had known she was right. He'd known it for months, maybe longer, but knowing something and accepting it are two different things. He pulled the Monaco into its usual spot in the motor pool, right next to the flagpole where the American flag and the Mississippi state flag hung in the still morning air. The car looked tired. The white paint had faded to a dull cream color, marked by rust spots and the accumulated grime of 15 years of service. The green stripe was barely visible anymore, worn away by the sun and the rain. The sheriff's star on the door was still there, still gleaming. Jim had made sure that, had polished it just last week, but it seemed to be the only part of the car that hadn't surrendered to time. The interior smelled like it always did. Stale coffee, tobacco smoke, from the deputies who smoked, not Jim, who'd never been a smoker, leather, and something indefinable that was just the smell of service, of duty, of 15 years of work. The steering wheel was warm under his hands, even though the engine hadn't been running. Or maybe it was just warm from the October sun coming through the windshield. Or maybe it was warm because the car was alive in its own way and it was responding to his presence. Jim sat there for a long time, not turning the key, just sitting. He thought about all the calls he'd answered in this car. The domestic disputes where he'd talked people down from the edge of violence. The accidents where he provided first aid and comfort to the injured while waiting for the ambulance. The pursuits where the Monaco's 440 engine had given him the power to chase down speeders and criminals. The nights he'd spent parked on the side of the road, just being present, letting folks know that the law was there, watching over them. He thought about Deputy Bobby Simmons, his first partner, who'd learned the job in the passenger seat of this very car. Bobby had gone on to become a state trooper, had moved to Jackson, had a family and a good life. But he still called Jim sometimes, still talked about those early days, still spoke with gratitude about the lessons he'd learned in the Monaco. He thought about Miguel Rodriguez. No, wait, that was a different story, a different car, a different state. But there had been people like Miguel in Yazoo County, too. People whose lives had been touched by Jim's service, whose crises had been averted because a man in a white Dodge Monaco had shown up at the right moment and done the right thing. He thought about the freeze of 1976, when he'd spent 3 nights patrolling the back roads, making sure that stranded motorists had help, that families trapped by unexpected cold had a way to get to safety. The Monaco had run all night, its engine never faltering, its heater keeping Jim warm as he worked. He thought about the flood of 1973, when the Yazoo River had risen beyond its banks and threatened to wash away entire communities. Jim had used the Monaco to evacuate families, to deliver supplies, to coordinate with the National Guard and the state police. The car had forded water that came up to the hood, had climbed muddy banks that would have defeated a lesser vehicle, had proven its worth over and over again. 15 years, 5,475 days, 131,400 hours, over 200,000 miles. That's how much time Jim and the Monaco had spent together, how much ground they'd covered, how much work they'd done. And now it was ending. Jim finally turned the key. The 440 engine fired up with its familiar rumble. That deep, authoritative sound had become as much a part of Yazoo County as the swamp water and the red clay. The engine settled into its idle, smooth and strong, as if it was saying, "I'm still here. I'm still ready. Whatever you need, I'm ready." But Jim wasn't going to need it anymore. Not like this. Not in the way he had for the past 15 years. He drove the Monaco out of the motor pool slowly, taking a long way through the county, not following any particular patrol route, just driving. He drove past the courthouse, that grand old building where he'd testified in countless trials. He drove past the high school, where he'd spoken to students about the dangers of drugs and the importance of respecting the law. He drove past a Methodist church where he and Margaret had been married 32 years ago, where they'd raised their children, where he'd served as a deacon for the past 10 years. He drove past the small towns that dotted the county, Yazoo City, Bentonia, Satardia, places where he knew everyone by name, where he'd helped deliver a baby once, in the backseat of the Monaco, no less, where he'd talked teenagers out of bad decisions, where he provided comfort to grieving families. And everywhere he went, people waved. They recognized the white Dodge Monaco with the sheriff's star on the door. They recognized Jim behind the wheel. And they waved, not just as a greeting, but as a thank you, as an acknowledgement of service, as a farewell to something that had been constant in their lives. By mid-afternoon, Jim found himself at the edge of the swamp, on a dirt road that led nowhere in particular, just wound to the cypress trees and the Spanish moss, past the murky water where alligators sunned themselves and herons fished in the shallows. He pulled the Monaco off the road, into a small clearing where the trees opened up enough to let the sun through. He sat there for a long time, engine idling, radio crackling occasionally with calls for other units. But not for him. Not anymore. At 4:47 p.m., Jim picked up the radio handset. His voice when he spoke was steady, but there was something in it, a finality, a weight, a recognition of an ending. Dispatch, this is Unit 1. I'm 10 to 7 for the last time. Unit 1 is out of service. Permanently. There was a pause. Then the dispatcher's voice came back, and Jim could hear the emotion in it, the understanding of what was happening. 10 to 4, Unit 1. We copy. You've been a good partner. Take care of yourself out there. Jim set the handset back in its cradle. The radio would continue to crackle, would continue to carry the voices of the other units, the other deputies who would carry on the work. But Jim's voice wouldn't be among them anymore. He sat there as the sun moved lower in the sky, as the shadows grew longer, as the swamp began to settle into the twilight. The Monaco's engine ticked as it cooled, a familiar sound that Jim had heard thousands of times. The breeze rustled the Spanish moss, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, a lonely sound in the gathering darkness. Finally, as the sun touched the horizon and painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, Jim reached over and turned the key. The engine shut off. The lights went dark. The radio went silent. And in that silence, Jim Caldwell reached over and patted the dashboard of the 1978 Dodge Monaco, right where the steering column met the instrument panel. He patted it gently, the way you might pat the neck of a horse that had carried you faithfully for years. "Good work," he said quietly. "You did good work. Thank you for being there. Thank you for never letting me down." He sat there for a few more minutes, just breathing, just being present with the car in the moment. Then he opened the door, stepped out into the cool evening air, and walked away from a Monaco for the last time. 43 years later, the 1978 Dodge Monaco sits at the edge of the swamp in Yazoo County, Mississippi, half hidden by the Spanish moss that drapes from the cypress trees like the shroud of time itself. The white paint has faded to a pale gray, marked by rust and decay. The green stripe is barely visible anymore, just a ghost of what it once was. The sheriff's star on the door has weathered and faded, but it's still there, still visible to anyone who knows to look for it. The windows are cloudy with age and moisture, and the interior has been reclaimed by the swamp. Vines grow through the floorboards. Moss covers the seats. Spiders have built their webs in the headlight housings. Birds nest in the engine compartment. The tires have long since deflated and crumbled, and the car has settled into white sand as if it's becoming part of the landscape itself. The engine will never run again. The transmission will never shift. The radio will never crackle with dispatch. The lights will never shine. The siren will never wail. But if you look closely, if you understand the language of metal and time, you can still see what it was. The body-on-frame construction, solid as the day it was built, refusing to collapse. The Dodge emblem on the grille, faded but still present. The 440 Magnum badge on the hood, barely legible but still there. And that sheriff's star on the door, weathered and worn, but still gleaming with a faint dignity that time hasn't quite managed to steal. The swamp has tried to reclaim it. The sun has tried to bleach it. The rain has tried to rust it. The years have tried to erase it. But the Monaco remains, a sentinel standing watch over a landscape that has changed beyond recognition. The small towns that Jim Caldwell once patrolled are mostly empty now, their young people having fled to Jackson or Memphis or beyond. The roads he drove have been widened and paved and modernized. The way of life he represented, the small-town sheriff, the community lawman, the man who knew everyone and cared about everyone, that's mostly gone now, replaced by state police and federal agencies and the bureaucracy of modern law enforcement. But the Monaco is still there, still standing, still remembering. Sheriff Jim Caldwell passed away in 2003 at the age of 77, in his sleep, with Margaret holding his hand. His children and grandchildren came to his funeral, and they told stories about the man he'd been, the service he'd given, the lives he'd touched. They didn't talk much about the car. By then, it had been abandoned for so long that most of them had forgotten about it. But if they had known where it was, if they had walked out to that clearing at the edge of the swamp and seen the Monaco sitting there among the dead cypress trees and the Spanish moss, they would have understood something important. They would have understood that service doesn't end when you hang up your badge. That duty doesn't fade just because you stop working. That the bond between a man and a machine, forged in service and sacrifice, can outlast both of them, can become something eternal, something that time itself cannot diminish. The Monaco is a memorial now, a monument to an era that's gone, to a way of life that time has forgotten, to a man who dedicated his life to service, and to the machine that served alongside him. It stands there in the swamp, weathered and worn, but still dignified, still proud, still bearing the sheriff's star on its door like a badge of honor that can never be taken away. The Spanish moss sways in the breeze, and if you listen carefully, if you understand the language of the swamp and the wind and the passage of time, you might hear the faint echo of a radio crackle, the distant rumble of a 440 engine, the voice of a man saying one last time, 10 to 4. Unit 1 is out of service. Permanently. And in that silence, in that stillness, in that moment where the past meets the present and time stands still, the 1978 Dodge Monaco continues its watch. Not over the roads of Yazoo County anymore, but over the memory of what was, over the legacy of a man who cared, over the truth that some bonds are stronger than time, some promises are deeper than death, and some partnerships are eternal.